Hello, thank you. Yeah, so as Paul said, I run the working group for content and advertising, but today we're talking about validation. Yeah, some of you might recognize me as the guy who runs around with the mic, but now I get to actually speak with the mic. So, this session is kindly sponsored by XConnect, and to lead us off, we have Tim Ward from XConnect, who's going to talk a little bit about validation. Tim.
That was a really quick introduction, so thanks for. I was sitting there, what else is he going to say? So I think I mean we've spoken at many of the MEF events, and I have to say these events are wonderful. They're like sort of coming back and meeting all the family again, and you catch up with those who you've not seen for a while. This particular session was really triggered by two things, but I think the last presentation really added in a third, which we probably need to provide a little more sort of insight to, and I can make some further comment on, because it really does fit into this whole realm of validation. But before we go there, let me sort of talk a little about what triggered this. There were last session that we did, Mr. Lane, who on that particular occasion had got his slides with him, and actually put up a slide. Do I need to press a button to actually move forward here? Yeah, that looks good. He actually put up this slide. We were talking about the whole issues of the CPaaS environment, and what were the top issues that those CPaaS platform providers were concerned about, and kind of what order that they would put them in. And as hopefully most of you can read this, I was struggling to read from the back, but anyway, it started off with fraud management, which I think is a bit of a no-brainer. That's exactly what you'd expect. It came on to carrier cost control, and I've got to say that makes 100% sense. And then the third came into something which is incredibly close to our hearts as XConnect on number validation. And it seemed to make sense that we should actually focus on that and really explore it a little more deeply, go into some more of the details about that and what that actually means. I would say it's a bit bad to think of this as an education session, because I think the audience here is probably the brains trust of this industry, and you all know more about it than any one of us possibly can when you put us all together. But I think in just going through some of the examples and how we're using number validation, how our customers are using number validation, makes really good sense as kind of a little bit of a further exploration. I said there were three triggers. So the second trigger was then that Jason and I actually were having a chat, and it turned into went out for dinner, and we started talking about some of these subjects of so how is validation being used? And it ended up as a real kind of ping pong conversation. We thought, well, this is a conversation that probably it would be we could share one way or another. Let's try and find a way of sharing some of the things that came up in there, because XConnect, and one of the reasons we're sort of sponsoring this, for those of you who don't know anything about us, we're an information provider. We're a pure information provider. We provide a number of data sets and sort of query services which are used by a good number of the people in this room to help them with number portability, which is really kind of that routing type application. They're using it for validation, which we'll come on to and talk about in some detail. They're also using it for fraud prevention. So we're really providing those very large data sets, the attributes specifically of telephone numbers, as a service, which is then being provided to the industry so that those kinds of decisions, whatever decision you guys need to make about how you're handling a particular transaction, can be based on some of that sort of very basic intelligence information, specifically of the numbers. And I think that's also a good way of kind of dividing up the session here, in that there's one piece which is really the financial aspects of it, the commercial aspects of it, focusing on sort of carrier cost control. What are the commercial issues that we're dealing with? How can validation techniques actually impact those commercials, basically save money, reduce the operating costs of the services we're providing to our customers or your customers? The second part of it, we felt should probably cover some regulatory things. I mean, we normally don't go into lots of depth talking about regulatory implications, but it is a good subject, and it's something which we're certainly seeing certain countries really focusing on now that the messaging business has become significant, now that voice is having to deal with the problems of email, basically spam, robocalling, as the Americans are referring to it as. Let's have a little bit of an exploration of those kind of regulatory challenges and how those can be addressed. And then the last part, which is so much the theme whenever we're doing these MEF events, is the fraud aspects of it. And maybe I'll give the game away now, but one of the messages that we tend to go for is actually although there are some very, very clever, intelligent, using artificial intelligence and learning systems and some very smart technologies which are going to help you with fraud, there are also some really, really basic things you can do. And in terms of validation, that can have a drastic impact. And I think that last session where we started talking about whether it's inflation or generation, by the way, my read on that, I'm now answering a question from a previous session, but my read on that is we're seeing one set of, well, let's call it inflation or generation that's coming from almost the end user, coming from the outside world. There are requests for calls, requests for messages that are coming from the population, from the subscriber base. But then I think there's another place where that inflation can happen, which is within the ecosystem. So I kind of look at it as outside the ecosystem is more the generation of traffic, and inside the ecosystem is more inflation of the traffic. That's just my view, so my apologies if that doesn't fit with other people's, but I was kind of seeing that as a little bit of a distinction. Now I make that distinction because when I'm thinking about some of these validation tasks, there's an awful lot you can do when somebody gives you as an A2P provider or a CPaaS provider or whatever you happen to be, the services you're providing to your enterprises, someone's given you a number. What do you do with it? So that's something that we certainly wanted to talk about. So.
Yep, thank you. So welcoming on stage as well, Jason Lunn from Cisco. So please have a seat, lads. So I think the basic idea here is that it's kind of a conversational, as Tim said. We have an information provider and a CPaaS provider. So I guess we're going to explore these different, mainly number validation, but these different forms of validation and what their different perspective is on those. So thank you guys for joining us. It's good to be here. So first off, what are the kind of practical examples for validation for different traffic types?
So, I mean, maybe I can kind of start that out. And I very much look at it as the flow, or a flow. It's not the flow, but it's a flow. You're starting off with that very simple process of someone's given you a number, as I just described. You've got a data entry. It may be they've gone to a web page and they're just typing in a number. And there's some very, very basic bits of validation you can do there. I mean, obviously, there are approaches where you can use smart libraries that will do that checking for you. There are processes where you can just look at basic rules. Has it got the right number of digits? Things like that. But you can take that a whole step further if you then start to think about, is it a number that's recognized? Is it recognized as belonging to a particular operator, something that is actually reachable? So there's a lot you can do right at that very, very first stage. And then you kind of look at the next step. One was data entry. The next was actually account setup. Someone is creating an account, or they're creating an opt-in, or they're creating that additional level of information. Now, rather than it just being a number, you've got the opportunity to do cross-referencing. You're getting additional attributes from that subscriber or contact or whatever it else is. And you've got the opportunity to start doing some cross-references. And I kind of think of a next step in this as almost when a transaction happens. Okay, I've collected data. I'm now at the point where a transaction is about to happen. I'm about to launch some form of transaction which causes something to happen. I have another opportunity to do some fairly basic validations. I might need to do some more complex validations if it is a more high value transaction. So we're really seeing a massive distinction, and I think Jason will probably get into a lot more detail on this, but we're seeing a distinction with our customers where you're looking at the appropriate level of validation for the type of transaction that it is. So it may be a very simple, can you give me some marketing information? You don't need to be too worried. You don't need to spend lots of money in validating you're giving that to the right person. But the moment that transaction is, I want to transfer £2,000, I now want to be a little more careful about it. And I'm going to do, okay, I'm still going to do those basic validations. Does it exist? Do I know who it belongs to? Do I know which carrier to contact to actually complete this transmission of data? But I can also now be doing things like, has there been a swap of the SIM? You know, some of these other validation functions which you might be using for a much higher value transaction. And I always feel it's about appropriate validation. It's not that you validate yes or no. It's how much do you need to validate for the particular thing you're actually trying to do at that moment. And then I can sort of, I keep on going through all of these different types of transaction, because another one is when you decide to make a call out. For some reason, you as a platform provider or you as an enterprise have decided to make a call rather than just complete a transaction. You are trying to make contact with that end user. And then there's another piece when that caller is calling you. You've got an inbound call. So I look at each of these. I could say very selfishly, the thing I quite like about it is every one of these needs a step of validation, and that means I get a query asking me, is this a good number? Or maybe you're maintaining that data yourself. But I think those are kind of the examples that we have in mind, where we're seeing every one of these steps has an appropriate, basic, more complex, full opportunity for that validation process. And I don't know, Jason, from your point of view, if you expand on some of that.
Yeah, a few weeks ago, I was asked to present to some of our Cisco colleagues. I think you probably know now, we used to be part of IMI. We were acquired by Cisco a couple of years ago, so we're embedded in that business quite well now. And so I was asked by some of the Cisco colleagues to help them understand what lookups were, what was validation. And so it can be a bit of a dry subject at times.
Try to make it fun.
Saying, look, it's not a sexy subject, is it? And bringing up a slide saying, look, primarily there are 4 different types of lookup service for validation. And you can see them starting to go straight away, but this is about what benefit does it bring to the business? It makes you more secure. It saves you money. It provides better service to your customers. All those things, it is absolutely worthwhile doing. And so going back to your point around some of those kind of validations, doing the basic number for onboarding a customer, what's the length of the number, those kind of things, they're great. And all of us could do it in our own home country easily without going to any libraries, without going to use any lookup services. Now do that across all 200 odd countries in the world. Now maintain that data. That's a whole different problem. And so it needs a slightly different approach to maintain data at that level.
And I should say thank you to Tim earlier on, Tim Biddle, who made a perfect point of just how complicated it is to actually maintain that global data set. And sorry to interrupt, but I think it's kind of like that complexity of that basic information. And I'll give one particular example. So, all right, 220 countries, that makes sense. Most people think of the global number plan or even national number plans as relatively static. You kind of think how many digits there are. In the UK, all mobile numbers start with a 7, right, I'm done. We maintain that data and provide updates to sort of pull data from all of the various regulatory sources and the various other number range data sources. And we see typically 20 to 40,000 changes. Now, those aren't numbers, those are ranges. So any one of those ranges could be 1 million or even 10 million numbers within it. So we see a huge, and I probably should call it churn. I'm not quite sure what but anyway, it's updates, the changes, the moves, add changes that we're seeing in what should be almost static data. Anyway, sorry, I was just...
No, that's good. Thank you. I think those use cases and that quality, if we want to do that onboarding, a quick validation number is perfect. If we're and then we go into more the kind of fraud type services. We can get into more detail later on, like SIM swap and things like that. For those types of services, you need to be doing a live lookup. What network is that handset on right now? Because you need to know to make sure you get it right, because the outcome of that potentially leads to fraud, and none of us want to see fraud, or be defrauded ourselves or our friends or family. So getting the right quality of validation and lookup is absolutely essential to every one of those different use cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the answer is that it's complex. Basically, it depends on the circumstance, and also as you say, the data is dynamic. It's constantly changing, so it's very difficult to maintain. What is the sort of commercial impact then for number validation?
I mean, when we're talking to our users, it usually starts off with a very simple one, which is if I'm given a rubbish number, it's just wrong, and I'm being asked to deliver a message to it. A lot of my agreements, even if I don't deliver that message or they don't deliver that message for me, I'm still going to get charged for it. So there's an incredibly simple commercial payback, which is if you can eliminate, let's say 5 or 10%, which are just simple invalid entries, you've immediately improved your cost base. Now, okay, some countries or some operators won't charge you for undelivered messages, but a lot do. You probably have a lot more experience of that than I do, but it certainly comes across in that way. And I think there's another piece which we found really interesting, which is, so much of our industry is measured on its delivery success rate. If you can eliminate the stuff which you couldn't have delivered in the first place, your success rate instantly goes up. And it's an important measure. You're able to say, look, as long as you give me good data, I'll deliver it for you. And I don't know how you would add to that, but that certainly is what we've perceived.
Yeah, I think it is about stopping that data being processed downstream, because that reduces the load downstream, which is great. So you don't get those kind of costs. But actually, the kind of models we use are well around using the data for reconciliation purposes. Are we being billed correctly? Sorry, all the aggregators and operators out there who may be billing us incorrectly and us putting your invoices into dispute. But we're doing it to make sure all of the quality of all of our systems are accurate and fair and responsible. Because if we're being charged this much over here by our suppliers, operators, and our customers are only paying us this amount, we've got a problem. And so we've got to be able to get that right. And in some countries with the cost of messaging going up and up and up, or any of these services, some of the identity services are getting quite expensive, but they're quite detailed and quite sensitive information as well. We have to make sure we get that right as the volumes increase.
Absolutely. And then what's sort of the impact when it comes to the regulatory side of things?
Do you want to start on that, or?
Go for it.
I think, we've seen certain requirements being thrown in by the regulators. It's kind of strange in that a lot of what I think most of us do in this in this room are not heavily regulated. When you think of the regular voice interconnect between carriers and the international delivery of traffic, well, that is heavily regulated. It's got pricing regulations, it's got delivery requirements. But when we move to the SMS world, it becomes less. When you move to the A to P world, it's now a business world, and there is much less concern over the regulations. Industry can regulate itself, should regulate itself, and I think most of us do really believe that's why we've ended up with codes of practice, that we're really trying to ensure we're doing the right thing. However, we've then got the situation that the US, I think, has really responded to incredibly strongly in the last couple of years, which has been about, first of all, robocalling, the whole concept of there being a database. And I don't know if any of you are delivering voice into the US, but if you do, if you're providing those gateway services, you need to register your mitigation plan in a database. And if your mitigation plan is not, now this is the challenging bit, sufficient. I'd love to know what that definition of sufficient was, but anyway, that's for someone else to debate. If it's not sufficient, then you will be identified by the FCC, and their enforcement group about, I think 8 weeks ago, actually issued 7 enforcement orders, which was removing smaller carriers from their enforcement database to say, if you don't come up with a decent plan, we're not going to allow anyone in the US to terminate your traffic. So we're not actually going to sanction you, but we're not going to let anybody else terminate your traffic, which is a really interesting sort of third-party stick to beat the industry with. So the mitigation database comes in, then they've got down to more technical rules. So we're now in a position where if you're terminating any traffic that actually looks like a US number into the US, you've got to make sure that you've checked that that number is actually valid.
It's not some random number that's being generated to look like a US number. There's also a requirement, and this is an area where this is another data set that we maintain as a company, which is a do not originate list. So you're looking to ensure that those numbers that should never, they're entirely valid, but they should never originate a call. So let's make sure that those are not originating some sort of dummy call that looks like it's come from, well, the IRS, let's say, the tax service in the States. They have numbers that you can call them on, but those numbers should never call you. But it does mean they're in people's mobile phones. So you see that caller ID come in and it says it's a call from the IRS. I might answer that call. So by identifying those numbers and really having the industry identify the invalid or the do not originate numbers, you're ending up with another data set which can be used effectively to limit some of those types of fraud. None of these are perfect solutions, but they're all about limitation of damage. And I think that is the approach that the FCC is taking in saying, okay, people describe this as a whack-a-mole thing, I'll bang that one down, and I'll bang this one down, and eventually we'll sort of get these things under control. And I think that's where this validation comes in. So those things I've just been describing, we're now in the position where someone takes a voice call into the US, they need to validate that it's come from a recognized number, that that number belongs to a recognized operator, that that operator isn't on the list of forbidden operators. So you need to be able to do all of those. So you need to validate the number before you've even started to get the number into the country. Then you must make sure it's not on the DNO list. So you have a sort of process that you're going through, all of which are validation stages. The next bit is, 6 weeks ago, they announced, right, we're interested in how we apply these rules to messaging. Now, we look around the world and we see there's now, I think, 8 countries that have issued recommendations or regulations on validating inbound traffic that comes into their country, mainly for voice, but I am absolutely convinced that's going to end up exactly the same for messaging. So here is another case where having the means to validate against a database of some sort, a numbering database, simply, is it on the list? Nothing more complicated than that is a very important step that you should take.
Yeah,
As you see, I can talk forever on these things.
I think when you say regulatory, I always think about what can we do as an industry? What can we do ourselves to save regulatory compliance coming in? Because it is a rather large overhead. Mm-hmm. Especially when you talk about stir and shaken, I suspect not many people in the room want the same to happen in messaging. And so I think most of around UK, Spain, Ireland, MEF now has its sender ID registry process. That's going really well. It's continuing to expand. In the UK, 25 merchants now using that service. So it is growing. There's another, looking at Dario, another 10, I think, if I can find him, another 10 to come on through the NCSC in the next 6 months or so. So that's going to be at like 35 merchants. Most government departments will be on there now. So that's going really well. So I think there are other countries where we can roll out these kind of verification type services and do them in a better way as well. The model we'd had in the UK was something that, we pulled together 5 years ago. It worked really well once we've got everyone together, and it's expanded and we've rolled that into more countries. But we're now starting to explore other business models, other ways of doing that in other countries, so we can put that on a whole different scale, really, to help protect all of our industry, because this is about make sure we're doing the right thing, but make sure we do it in a controlled, proportionate way for all of us before the regulators come and stamp all this approval and regulatory effort on us that is or could be, sorry, not is, but could be quite significant. So that's my opinion anyway.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think who knows our industry better than us? And so if we come together and we decide, hey, we're going to do this right by this guideline, we can do it in a better way with less vague restrictions and stuff like that.
Absolutely, I think. Also I think about sender ID registry. When I started that process, 5 years ago. Sorry, for those of you who don't know, I sit on the MEF board as well and give guidance and direction to the sender ID registry, as well as being the growth committee chairman. And so, I've got a lot of time and a lot of heart into the sender ID registry over the years, and I can see the value there. And we want to continue to provide that, because that will benefit all of us. But I don't think it's about A2P messaging. It's about what about other channels can we put into there as well, I won't list them out now, but I think some of the other channels that we could possibly cover, and how do we make that work? Because the validation around that, some of the processes are very similar when you look at the US model about validating our business and then going into validating or obtaining the number, validating the campaign. You could have similar kind of processes in other places or slightly different mix maybe of these systems. So yeah, I think there'll be a lot of movement in there, and we'll certainly be coming to people asking for help and advice in that area from the MEF community over the next 6 months or so.
Yeah, good plug for MEF. Yeah. So I want to go over to fraud. What's the impact there for with number validation?
Well, when I wrote myself some notes just to remind myself what I should talk about. I think I wrote down callback fraud. We should talk about callback fraud. What I actually meant, I should have said, was the artificial inflation of traffic, because it really is exactly that. One very specific application which we've worked with a kind of large global brand on really came about from their fraud group. Their fraud and security group said, look, we, in running kind of call center and commerce applications, are seeing huge number of requests for callback. These are actually being generated outside, which was kind of the point I made earlier on. In other words, they're not being generated within the ecosystem of the messaging world or the voice world. They're coming from somewhere out there. And there's even things like people automating the process of signing up for an account. So they'll generate 10,000 new accounts with random emails, random phone, well, not so random, but phone numbers, and I'll come back to that in a moment, and effectively looking for a callback. They're looking to see a one-time authentication to set up that account. Unfortunately, the numbers that's been provided fall into a number of categories. One is they're a premium rate number. Now, I know exactly what a premium rate number looks like in the UK. Being brought up with the damn things. However, I have absolutely no idea what a premium rate number looks like in some other country. So they're relatively difficult to recognize unless you are really familiar with each particular country you're looking at. And you could say, okay, well, just make sure you maintain a list of premium rate numbers. But that's not easy when there's these distinctions between a true premium rate number and, as we heard earlier on, revenue share numbers and effectively higher rate numbers. So knowing what a number range is and being able to identify, first of all, that attribute. Is it a special number? Has it got some special billing associated with it? But also knowing actually which carrier it belongs to. So I'm not just saying I'm going to send this to Albonia. There we are. That's a good one for some of us who are of an age. It's a Dilbert book, country, false country that doesn't belong to anywhere. But anyway, Albonia. So we're sending a premium rate out to Albonia. Maintaining that information is a whole challenge in its own right. So that attribute of the number range is the first start. The next bit is knowing actually which carrier it is. So if I then receive a charge for that particular number, I'm actually able to go back and say, hold on a moment, that particular carrier has charged me $10. And that's typically what they've been seeing, a $10 callback, which is clearly highly fraudulent in someone trying to set up an account using that number. So, some of those really sort of basic checks in saying, what do I know about the number and do I know which operator it belongs to, is giving you an instant opportunity to discover that type of call setup type fraud. But it then goes on to any of those mechanisms within today's sort of web commerce world, remote commerce world, which are generating some sort of outbound message from the trading company. So that is a whole area. Now, I mean, these guys, we're talking literally millions of calls a day. The fascinating part was looking at some of the stats. And actually, whilst that conversation was going on earlier on, I actually pulled them up. I can show them on my tablet if you like, anonymized, of course. But they were showing sort of during the middle of the year in the summer period, they were getting 16% of the callback requests were
invalid in some way. They were numbers that didn't actually belong to any nominated operator. And to me, that is a huge quantity. Now, okay, you could just say, as I was talking about earlier on, I've just taken 16% of my callbacks out of my cost base. But it's not 16% of the cost, because those are the ones that would have cost you $2, $3, $5, $10 as opposed to 2, 3, 5 cents. So that cost could be huge. Now, obviously, I don't know of those invalid ones, how many of them were the bad charges, how many of them were just someone got the number wrong. But one way or another, you've removed that huge opportunity for failure, huge opportunity for fraud, huge opportunity for cost from that cost base by something really, really simple. Well, I say really simple because I know how difficult it is to maintain the information, but the actual process of just saying, check the number. Nothing cleverer than that. I'm not going to use any AI, any smart stuff. Just check the number, and you've immediately eliminated a huge chunk of fraudulent traffic from your callback base. Yeah. So now,
yeah,
are you seeing that in reality, or is it with the sort of customers that you've got?
I guess with a lot of our clients being, larger businesses, we don't tend to see that much of voice fraud traffic. We do see from some clients who may have been attacked on their website. So let's say if they have a website where you can sign up globally for a service, and there's two-factor authentication in that process, and they don't have a capture type service, they have been abused without a doubt. Some of our clients that way, and probably most people in this room as well, and you can identify that by doing the lookup, making sure you know what network the handsets are on, and looking for unusual patterns. There might be a country where a customer only sends 20, 30 messages an hour to, and all of a sudden, I won't list the country, but there was one country earlier this year where we saw 150,000 messages to one network, all in the same range, sequential numbers. Within 30 minutes. It's obviously fraud. It has to be stopped. In the end, our mitigation for that, because the customer couldn't stop it, was we disconnected the customer. They had to fix their website, and a week later, we allowed them to reconnect and then continue processing traffic. But we actually did have to stop the customer. So we have to take some very harsh lines sometimes, but that's because we're protecting ourselves and all of our customers. Our friends and family, you never know who's going to be next. And so we want to make sure we switch those kind of things off quickly to enable it. And hopefully everyone else in the room is doing the same kind of things. I think from the other side of it, in terms of the data, we're using like live lookups for, SIM swap and call forward detection and KYC and all those kind of data attributes. Has anyone else used sort of SIM swap much, or does everyone know what SIM swap is, by the way, when I say SIM swap? Does everyone understand it? Hands up if you understand it. I'll get an idea. Okay, about half the room. About half the room. Okay. So for those of you who don't, if I've got a SIM in this phone, if I was a fraudster, I basically want to move my legitimate phone number to a different SIM. And so what would happen is I port it through some methods I'm not going to talk about here as a fraudster, and that now means this fraudster now has control of my phone number. Let's assume I don't notice the signal's gone on my phone and the mobile operator let it happen and all those kind of things. Our financial services customers then mainly are the ones that do SIM swap checks. So when you try and then run a financial transaction with your card or something like that, they'll do a check and say, does Jason's phone still have the same SIM attached to it? Yes or no? And if it equals yes, then there's a high probability that it's okay. If it's a different IMSI, then the probability is no. It's a flag to say this is higher risk. It's not to say it is fraud or isn't fraud. It's just part of the risk mitigation process. And there are lots of other attributes you can use as part of that process. So doing that in real time with live data is absolutely critical to keep that latency down, because the last thing you want when you go to pay for something with your credit card is to be waiting for the machine to go round and round. I just want to go. I want to go home, I've got the kids' Christmas presents here or something. I want to go. And so there's those processes happening in the background to approve your card, and SIM swap is one of them. So yeah, lookups, latency, and all that kind of data is absolutely critical to us all.
Yep. When it comes to fraud, what do you think is where is the largest burden, shall we say, like the identification, or as you mentioned, the sort of data storage elements? Which do you think is more of a challenge?
I don't know, actually. They're both very challenging in their own way. I think it depends on the industry. Validating that customer's traffic, where there is fraud, say, against a particular network for artificial inflation, that's hard to pick up in real time. There can be some latency in that process, for sure.
Cool. So what about the importance of telephone numbers as sort of the global identifier between all these different channels? What's the...
I always have this as kind of one of my little rants almost, remember the phone number, mainly because we do number information services. It says it on the tin. That's what our company does. So the numbers are key. But it just seems so clear when we look at, obviously, the stats that Nick was putting up earlier on in terms of the services. They're using a phone number. They're using an E164 telephone number as one of the primary, well, the routing attribute, but also the identity attribute that goes with it. And those two things are this is one of the few mechanisms that is universal. It's pretty much recognized everywhere. It actually works at a global level. I haven't really got any other addressing mechanism that does. And I think, when, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, I was being told, yeah, but you're concentrating on numbers. Shouldn't you be concentrating on other identifiers? And you stick to your guns and you say, no, numbers are going to live on. They're going to be the core to this business. And I think actually most of us in here probably I'm singing to the converted, but I think we all are also dependent on the phone number as a primary identifier. We've got to make sure then that those numbers can be trusted. So, whether it's trust in telecoms or trust in messaging or trust in numbers, I really feel we've got to make sure that those numbers can be trusted and that we have mechanisms in place just to check for bad stuff. And then additional technologies to prove that they're right. So I think each of these sort of elements, building that trust in numbers, we still don't have any better mechanism for actually addressing a communication to anyone in this room. So let's make sure that we look after them.
Agree.
Yeah, you both agree.
Absolutely.
I just said I can preach on this one.
I think we started a bit late, so I think we have a bit more time. Yeah, so I'll ask one more question, then maybe we can, if any of the audience has a question. What are the sort of basic attributes of a number for validation?
Well, I kind of remind people, does it exist? There is primary attribute number one. And, when you're looking at the global number plan or global numbers, we've got trillions of numbers available within the global number plan. And there's about sort of 10 billion that are good ones. Maybe it's a bit more than that, maybe more like 15 or 20. But that's actually quite a small proportion. So it's quite easy just to say, does it exist? And then I always think, you've got other bits which, again, are more like format, more about rules. Does it fit the rules that should be out there for each particular country? But you have the challenge, every country is different. But at least you can actually maintain and keep a recognition of those rules. And then I think what I talked about earlier, is there anything special about it? Is there anything obscure or different charging or inbound only, outbound only, IoT? Each of those are attributes that you don't normally get to see. So there's a need for that as an additional data set or data sets to make those available so you can make intelligent decisions about whether you do actually use a number for the purpose it's being given to you for. So anyway, I think that's the way we see it at a basic level.
I think I agree with is the number valid? I'm always surprised by the number of customers who can't type a phone number. And get it wrong, put dashes and miss numbers out and those kind of things, And so, it is one of the first steps in that process, without a doubt, to say, is this a real number or not? Because a percentage of the time, depending on the client and depending on the country, it can vary quite wildly.
Great. Okay, would anyone have any questions? Now's your chance. These guys are the experts. No? Okay. Well, I have more questions. We can keep going. So I guess I want to talk about RCS and, with services like Google Business Verification, how do you see that making a difference to the requirement for number verification?
So for myself, at the moment, we have like 2 stages. We need to do a lookup to say what network handset's on, and then we need to do a discoverability check. I think at some point in the future, it would be nice to have those combined, I have to say. That would really reduce the latency and speed up the time of delivery of messages. I don't think we've had too much of a problem on it to date because the volume has been low. I know the numbers are getting big in some countries that we're processing, but we're able to cope with those numbers. But as the numbers start to take over, let's assume that 50% of SMS goes to RCS. You've got to think, will the infrastructure cope? Will it be able to deliver at the kind of latency we're used to in SMS? Probably not, because in SMS world, we've been refining and optimizing that world with SMSCs and our infrastructures for the last 25 years. In RCS, we've only really been doing it for the last 5 to 10 years. We've got a long way to go to optimize this. And so, yeah, for me, I think putting those 2 together would really speed up process of making RCS more viable and usable for things like one-time passcodes and those kind of things, where we can do them at scale.
Yeah, I think that last point you made about the optimization we've gone through with what was a kind of almost an accident SMS, it wasn't ever designed to do the job it does. But we have refined it and refined it and refined it. So, I think of the SMS world of sort of 7 or 8 years ago, where you wanted to do a number portability query and you're looking at probably half a second to do it, something like the days when HLR queries were being used for that sort of thing. The refinement of that process was, okay, you move it to a database process. Standard database access for us is just over a millisecond. So you've gone from a few hundred milliseconds down to 1 millisecond. Now, RCS has got to go through almost that same learning and putting the infrastructure and the processes in place that you're able to do that kind of delivery. And it matters when somebody says, right, I've got 20 million messages to deliver today. But I can't wait that long.
SMS is doing it today based on the scale as well, compared to what we had 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago. Not this number of handsets. It's quadruple the number of handsets. Porting in, I'm not saying every country, but in most countries now compared to where it was even 10 years ago.
Yep.
All that evolution of the market has happened, but we're still doing it faster and faster.
Yeah, so we've got 104 countries that have got number portability now. Most of the average of those is just over 20% porting rate. In the bigger countries, we're seeing more 30 to 40% porting rate. So it has a huge impact on that deliverability and the performance. Sorry, throw those stats out.
Yeah.
That would agree with what we're seeing, say, just in this country or the US or somewhere.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Do you want to leave some closing remarks before we finish up?
I think for me, probably 2 closing remarks. Something I mentioned earlier, validation and number lookups really aren't sexy, but they'll save you a lot of hassle and a lot of effort in your business, and probably a lot of money as well, actually, in terms of getting it right. And secondly, I'll say, look, if you're not involved in the registry program today with MEF, please get involved. The 3 markets is currently live in our UK, Spain, Ireland, but there are more markets coming, and so we are going to evolve that process. So get involved in that so that we can make sure we maintain the market and make it as secure as possible for everyone.
Great. And Tim?
I think I'd repeat kind of where I started out, which was keep it simple. There's some really basic things you can do that have a big impact, and you should do those things. You don't have to worry about the 100%. If you can get rid of 80% of the problems, you've had a real impact by doing something very straightforward. So I think that would be our message as well. There are some really basic things you can do just to look after your numbers.
Great.
So I think there was someone who had the hand up.
Oh, is there a question? There. Oh, yeah. There she is, yeah. Susan's running.
I I just had one question. You mentioned businesses, but what does an individual do if they think their number has been swapped? They can't do a number lookup. They can't, potentially they are trapped by their phone. There's nothing that they can do. And a company probably has more resources. But what does an individual do in that situation?
The individual should follow go to their operator and speak to them about getting a resolution. I know they may not be able to do that because they don't have their own device, but they can normally use someone else's device or a landline or whatever they can reach to get hold of the operator. But it's the operator who owns that relationship and can then do something about that situation.
But just to go into comment on that, but I think they're actually failing, because if you go to a shop, so if it's Vodafone or if it's O2 or whatever, you're only dealing with individuals there who only have limited capacity to help you in that situation. And if your phone is affected and you go to a friend whose number might be on it, etc., you don't know who you're getting through to then that can actually, what can they do over the phone? You're really in a very difficult kind of situation. It's a very vulnerable situation. If you have a business at home, if you're working remotely, your entire company, your compliance, everything could go down the drain. I just wonder, are the operators not taking more responsibility?
I don't know if we've got any operators in the room who'd be willing to share any insights.
I just saw a tennis racket come out there.
I think that's probably a question we need to ask an operator or some operators to get some insight into. But agree, it would be definitely challenging to an individual if their handset was or their number was swapped by a fraudster.
To the handset.
Again, I think we need to speak to some operators around
so they can't
what
be swapped, then.
Sorry?
So they can't be swapped then. So is it to attach a number to a handset so they can't be swapped?
Well, they are. Initially, they're attached to a SIM.
Mm-hmm.
And then there should be a process that the operator implements to prevent fraudsters from moving the phone number from one SIM to another.
But integral to the phone?
It's not integral to the phone, no.
But is that not a solution?
I don't know is the truthful answer. We'd need to liaise with the operators and the technical experts in that area, I'm afraid.
Yeah, I think we need to wrap up now anyway. Thanks for that. It was a great discussion. Very easy people to moderate, I would say.
But yeah, never moderate.
And again, this was sponsored by XConnect, so thank you for sponsoring us. And yeah, have a good one.
Thank you.